Well, thank you, everyone. I have the privilege of introducing our next panel, Regime Stenographers, How the Media and Their Allies Escalate Conflict. Now, one quick note, you'll notice in your programs that Josh Hammer was meant to be one of our panelists today. Micah Meadowcroft is not Josh Hammer. Josh had a last-minute emergency that he needed to attend to, but you all are in good hands with Micah here on this panel. It also means that my introduction of the panel is very similar to my introduction of our weekly podcast, Tech Right Now, which you should all go check out, listen to, subscribe to, and rate 5 stars, please. On our panel here today, we have Helen Andrews. Helen is senior editor at the American Conservative, author of Boomers, The Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster, an excellent book that I would encourage you all to go buy. She has worked at the Washington Examiner and National Review, and is a think tank researcher in Australia. She has a Bachelor of the Arts in Religious Studies from Yale University and has written very widely in places like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, First Things, and elsewhere. Next to Helen is Micah Meadowcroft, who I mentioned earlier. He is managing editor here at the American Conservative and co-host of our magazine's podcast, Tack Right Now. In addition to Tack, his writing has appeared in publications such as The New Atlantis, the Wall Street Journal Book Section, and the American Affairs Journal. He's also a 2021-2022 Robert Novak Journalism Fellow at the Fund for American Studies and has his BA from Hillsdale College. Next, we have Lee Smith. Lee is a veteran journalist whose work appears in Real Clear Investigations, The Federalist, and Tablet. He's worked in media for 30 years, writing about national politics, foreign policy, and the press. He reported from the Middle East for a decade after the 9/11 attacks and wrote critically acclaimed The Strong Horse, Power Politics, and the Clash of Arab Civilizations. He is also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. And then lastly, we are honored to have Mollie Hemingway joining us today as well. Mollie is a senior journalism fellow at Hillsdale College, where she teaches journalism and helps students and alumni with professional development. Mollie helped launch and is a senior editor of the online magazine The Federalist, which has become one of the most influential voices on politics with millions of readers at their site. Mollie is a Fox News contributor and a regular member of the Fox News All-Stars panel on Special Report with Bret Baier and a regular guest on Media Buzz by Howard Kurtz. So I'm going to leave it there and hand it over to Helen to begin our panel.
Thank you very much, Emil, for that kind introduction. Although I wish you hadn't mentioned the Yale thing. I'm deeply ashamed of that now. Earlier this week, the German embassy in the United States issued the following tweet. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is a criminal offense. Anyone publicly approving the war may be liable to prosecution in Germany. This applies to using the Z symbol as well. German security authorities are keeping an eye on the use of that symbol. And Germany is not the only country to criminalize dissent on this particular issue. Just a few days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Prosecutor General of the Czech Republic said that anyone expressing support for Russia on social media would be subject to prosecution. I believe Baltic countries have issued similar statements. I hope I don't need to belabor the irony that the side of this conflict that plumes itself on its adherence to liberal values, in contrast to those backward, tyrannical Russians, should be the ones prosecuting people for social media statements dissenting from the ruling class orthodoxy. Thankfully, here in the United States, we do not need to worry about being prosecuted for dissenting from the voices calling for escalation of our involvement in this conflict. But we do need to worry, not about prosecution, but about pressure. There are many people in this room who remember the run-up to the Iraq War, and we see today precisely the same kinds of rhetorical, I won't even call them tools, they're rhetorical tricks, like smearing anyone who expresses skepticism of escalation as a tool of the Kremlin. And the crowning irony, or for me at least, the crowning frustration of seeing this dynamic play out again today, the same way that it did in the early 2000s, is that in many cases it is not just the same maneuver, but the same individuals. It's the very same people who were writing the pieces that they wrote in the Weekly Standard, and today are writing the same things in places like The Bulwark. And I suppose at some level, you can't really get mad at these people. I mean, Bill Kristol gonna Bill Kristol. But what I do feel as if we have a right to complain about is that the mainstream journalists, not the opinion authors, but the straight journalists, are failing to fulfill their main responsibility, which is objective coverage of this war. Early in the conflict, just from observing the way that our government was acting, I quickly deduced that our government was behaving as if our goal was not a swift end to this conflict or a swift peace agreement and saving the lives of Ukrainian people. We were behaving as if our main priority was to weaken Vladimir Putin, and that maybe a good way to do that might be to entangle him in a long-running insurgency in the Ukraine, that we wanted to draw out the war as long as possible. But it was difficult to find people who would go on record saying that that was our goal. It was simply something you could deduce from our actions. And it was Neil Ferguson, of all people, who is not himself a journalist, he's a historian with a column on the side, who was finally let the cat out of the bag and said, I have been in rooms with decision makers in American foreign policy, and that's what they're saying behind closed doors, that the only off-ramp here is for Vladimir Putin to lose power, and that entangling him in another Afghanistan would actually be really great. And it wasn't until the president himself blurted out a few days ago. In some ways we're lucky that the president is the way he is. We learn a lot of things we might not otherwise learn. But if not for that, there are lots of things that we would only know from deduction, from drawing conclusions. Why is it, I asked myself, that it fell to Neil Ferguson to blurt out that regime change in Russia is a policy goal of the United States? Journalists should be chasing down the story and trying to figure out the whys and hows of our foreign policy. That's what they should be doing, but it's not what they are doing. Instead, they're smearing people who are skeptics of escalation as Kremlin apologists. And so I'm very delighted to be on a panel with journalists who are an exception to that rule.
Thank you, Helen. As Emil told you, I'm not Josh Hammer. They replaced Josh with the other young editor with a beard and an Old Testament first name. So today, the fog of war has been made to look crystal clear. Each and every advance in communication technology, from the telegraph to the telephone, from the radio to television, and now on to our digital world of social media and live stream and TikTok, has added verisimilitude and detail to what fundamentally remains an illusion. We have, as civilians and journalists, at the end of the day, only pictures of wars. We do not actually see the thing itself. Indeed, one might argue that not even the soldier in a firefight sees the war. No man does, though the great military geniuses of history got closest. Napoleon and Caesar knew in war what was being done, what needed being done, what motivated men, and even some of what it would mean for history. We, all of us, must remember this then, both as writers and as readers. The tools of propaganda in mass society have only grown with the tools of mass communication, have only created a more immersive experience. To look back at the failure of Afghanistan is to be reminded that you cannot see any war in its entirety. Reports can be padded, numbers massaged to make everyone up the chain feel a bit better about how things are going and what their retirement opportunities will be. But there will be attempts to make you think you see the war. In a culture where the only agreed upon metaphysical reality is that death is an evil, indeed perhaps the highest evil, in such a culture, the willing courtship of death, The sacrifice of human lives is the only shared sacrament that can set us apart as a people, make our propositions and commitments holy. War is the only grand narrative allowed to media in a mass society where every other story is personal and subjective, the further liberation from the chains of history, tradition, and biology. There are always two wars, then, which are in the end still really one war. That between belligerents and that war waged in the information sphere by parties both known and unknown, state and non-state actors alike around the world. Since history is written by the victors, the thinking goes, if you write away now, you might just win. It is important to remember here that prestige political reporting is a thing of leaks. You develop your sources and report what they tell you. The utility goes both ways. Leaks are part of the geopolitical game. Reporters are tools, used for counterintelligence and disinformation. Incidentally, the personal profile of journalists and CIA analysts appears to be converging these days. But the vast technical improvements in the tool of its dissemination mean that propaganda today need not be subtle at all now. One might debate whether it was ever the American security state's Cold War partnership with industrialists and cultural influencers was more tasteful than today, but was it really less obvious? But in our moment, all that is beside the point. What is clear, as Daryl Cooper of the Invaluable Martyr Made podcast observed recently, is that modern propaganda doesn't even bother trying to convince, if even by deception. It merely says, if you think this, you're good. If you think that, you're bad, and then encourages the good people to go attack the bad people. This is the sacramental liturgy of modern war in modern media, in modern mass society. By making each conflict an ideological battle of light and darkness, our defense establishment and corporate media produce a brand new superhero flick for the masses to watch in real time, an augmented reality game for them all to play. What we Americans face in every opportunity for war is the tension between a moral desire for action and our responsible care for those things that we actually have personal responsibility for. The lies of propaganda let us focus on the first, feeling primed and passions ready to be directed, offering a pleasant distraction from the failures, our failures, at that second, the despair of our neighbors or the violation of our national sovereignty at our border. This is corrosive. Lies kill far more than ugly truths. Indeed, if the truth appears ugly to us, our aesthetic sense requires an adjustment. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a dissident from both the Soviet and liberal empires, prophesied against the danger of lies. Perhaps best known of his statements, but most easily forgotten, he warned of the laziness and pride that looks for simple stories of good and bad in human history and forgets our shared fallenness in the light of eternity. He said, if only it were so simple, if only there were people, evil people somewhere, insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lee Smith. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you to my fellow panelists, and thank you especially to the American Conservative and American Moment for hosting this. Really appreciate that, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to start off, unfortunately, not challenging or contesting too hard, but I want to say I actually believe that the media, as it's now constituted, is doing precisely the job that it's set out to do, and that job is not to inform the U.S. public. I think it's very important that we get our categories right and we understand the profound shift that has happened in the media over the last 20 years. Some of this has to do, of course, with technology. A lot of it has to do with the nature of how American politics has changed. What the press is now, it also has to do hardly coincidentally, with our foreign engagements. Remember, we've been speaking so long about China and about how bringing China into the liberal international rules-based order would invariably change China, and trading with China would change China. What's happened instead, as we all recognize, is that American officials, the American ruling class, has, by envying the autocratic habits of the CCP has in turn adopted them. Something very similar has happened with the press, in particular with our engagements in the Middle East over the last 20 years. The best model for understanding what the media is today is it's not as a partisan media. I've worked in the media for 30 years. My father was a journalist. My grandfather was in the media. My great-grandfather worked at the New York Daily News when that was an entirely different paper. So I've been around media my entire life, and I know that media has always leaned left, right? The last time, I believe that the last time the New York Times endorsed a Republican candidate for president was Eisenhower's second term. The Washington Post, as far as I know, has never endorsed a Republican candidate for president. Just so you understand, we've always known that the press tends to lean to the left, but this is not what we're talking about anymore. We're talking about the press as a part of the U.S. intelligence apparatus. That's what it is. So in third world terms, what this means is you have two different sectors of a hard security regime that have united. On one hand, you have the Ministry of the Interior, as it's referred to in the Middle East, and it's not like our Department of the Interior that takes care of the national parks. It's in charge of intelligence services. And that melds with the Ministry of Information. And these are the apparatchiks who push out the propaganda on behalf of on behalf of the regime and against the public to shape that reality. This is what we're experiencing today, and this will affect how we understand what's happening if we don't get our categories right, and if we don't understand how profoundly things have changed. I first started to see this happen when the Iran deal was first being pushed in 2013 and 2014, and I noticed it because they were all the same talking points, the same efforts that were going into manufacturing this relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran. But of course, for most of us, I know that Mollie has worked on this a lot, for most of us, we saw it happen with Russiagate. And what would happen in Russiagate? The most important component of Russiagate was not people like Rachel Maddow getting on television and sounding like a lunatic, frothing at the mouth. The most important component of Russiagate was the Pulitzer Prize-winning team of the Washington Post and the New York Times. Why is that? Because they were taking leaks of classified information and shaping that to undo an American presidency. So this is what I mean when I say it's important that we understand these new categories. That will help us understand different things that are happening now. For instance, Hunter Biden's laptop. A lot of people, especially on the right, celebrated the idea that finally the New York Times acknowledged the reality of the laptop. I encourage all of you, when you have a chance, to go back and reread that story. What you'll find is the New York Times has laid the groundwork for the DOJ to clear Hunter Biden. Right? There was no reason for anyone on the right to celebrate that. They're dismissing it. The effect that you walk away with is, we control reality. Sure, you may have published this 2 years ago, or whenever, it doesn't matter. We control the flow of information, and that's what matters, and that's what's important. So I look forward to our panel, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you. I, like Helen, also find it interesting to reflect on the media's role in the march to the Iraq War. You might recall when that happened and when the war was sold to the American people in large part on the claim that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And when no weapons of mass destruction were found, you had a bunch of people in the media sort of do these mea culpas. They all expressed this claim that they would never again be beholden to the intelligence apparatus, or that they would fail to check out allegations that were made. I think they issued those mea culpas to hide the real reason that they wanted to go to war in Iraq, and they never apologized for that real reason. So I think when we're talking about what to do in our current media environment, we should be clear-eyed about what situation we're operating in. And we had, for a long time in this town, a large bipartisan consensus on how to fight the Cold War. We had presidents who largely kept that cold instead of hot. When that Cold War ended, there was something of a vacuum where we experienced this growing support for democracy building and the spread of democracy. And we have been in that era for quite some time, the Francis Fukuyama era. We saw this happen with Bill Clinton in the media's support for the Baltic wars. We saw it most notably after 9/11 in the regime change effort in Iraq. We saw it, even more recently with the regime change effort in Libya. And those regimes were changed. We also saw a failed effort in Syria. We saw a really expensive and protracted and failed effort to get rid of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And we have people who, despite those failures, are still very religiously committed to this project, to the extent that they are willing to engage in it even now, where I am actually quite thankful that Biden admitted that his policy is regime change in Russia. Makes it a little bit more difficult for people to hide the purpose of the escalatory rhetoric that we have been seeing, the way that people have been talking about things. But I think when you see the type of reporters that are placed in the field and what they argue for, the type of pundits who are put on air and what they talk about, it's not a mistake, it's not an accident. It is because we have a media apparatus that is fully committed to this doctrine. They never apologized for it. I don't think they want to admit their failure because that's embarrassing, but also because it is this religious commitment that they have, so they're just not inclined to admit that failure. And we see also even how stories like the Russia collusion hoax fit into this. When Donald Trump ran for office in 2016, he was the only person to really take on this bipartisan consensus that we have in this town. For that reason, he had to be destroyed, and the Russia collusion hoax was that effort to be able to thwart any kind of foreign policy that did not seek to continue these types of efforts, no matter how failed they might be or how fraught with danger they might be. And so I think that brings us to the present moment. So I'm excited to talk more specifically about some of the issues we're dealing with, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yes. Oh, wonderful. I'm audible. So the title of this panel is Regime Stenographers. And that, of course, calls up the image of a journalist just taking down verbatim what they're told from their sources. So I want to talk a little bit about that relationship between journalists and their sources, and also draw out maybe some of the motivations behind these stenographers. Why do they do the things that they do? Mollie, in your conclusion there, you said some of it is just trying to save face and not wanting to apologize for past errors of judgment. Is that the chief motivation at work here? Is it ideological commitment? Is it just selfish, self-dealing, wanting to advance their own careers? What motivates a regime stenographer? And that's a question for all three of you.
All of the above, probably. I would also like to never neglect just the role laziness and stupidity play in some of these discussions. It's easier to go along with what people have said before. But one of the names that comes to mind for people who participate in multiple hoaxes like this, multiple hoaxes or multiple intelligence operations would be Natasha Bertrand. She's sometimes called Fusion Natasha because she was, in fact, just literally taking stuff from Fusion GPS, the discredited Oppo group that was hired by the Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee, and just regurgitating it. She was the woman who wrote, for instance, that the Hunter Biden laptop was a Russian disinformation. That was an intel op that she was happy to play a role in. And she's now at CNN. She is the NATO reporter at CNN. And so CNN is one of the many outlets that has been pushing for escalation in this conflict, seemingly oblivious to the downsides of what that might be. So it's not surprising to see the same name come up multiple times.
This is on. Barack Obama and his Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications, Ben Rhodes, changed the nature of national security reporting. What they did was they ensured that anyone who didn't take their line wouldn't get anything, wouldn't get leaks, wouldn't get quotes, and so couldn't produce stories. And if you can't produce stories on that beat, right? Well, if you can't produce stories on any beat, you're fired. So they retrained them. You will have to take our line. You will have to put out our line. This is, you're going to have to do it. And so, of course, this leads directly into Russiagate. All these people are now, because again, central component of Russiagate is the intelligence services, especially the FBI, and the Washington Post and the New York Times. That's the essential component. So all of these people had been trained to take this stuff, all the people on the national security beat. And remember, that's where it comes out of. It comes from national security reporters. And there's, the way I see it, they're not simply servicing their sources, right? After they've been trained, now they are a part of the intelligence apparatus. That's what's going on. So the structure of that beat has been changed since 2009, since Barack Obama and Ben Rhodes did it.
Well, and Ben Rhodes wasn't wrong to say these people are kids and they know nothing, and so we can just tell them things and create the echo chamber. I mean, I think a lot of this is to have a career in this industry, you do have to just listen, as Lee said, and report what they tell you. The text messages are what matters, I guess.
So one of the things we were taught to be afraid of in 2016 and 2017 during the Russiagate scandal was Russian interference in American politics. They had their tentacles everywhere, manipulating our democracy. Russian propaganda has been notably absent in the last month or so. They seem not to be very good at getting their side of the story out in the US media. So who do you think has a better propaganda operation in the United States right now, Russia or Ukraine?
Ghost of Kiev. I mean, that's. I'd love to see all those planes down. You know, where are they?
I actually think information war is an important part. It's one of the reasons why I enjoy the Hunger Games. I have children at the age that enjoy those books and movies, which is all about information warfare. And it is an important part. It shapes so much of what people talk about. So if you want to stop the destruction of Ukraine, you don't want the war to expand. If you don't want the destruction of Ukraine to spread to other countries, you're going to have one type of posture. So think about the different messages we've gotten that have moved things in an escalatory fashion. So it might begin with Vladimir Putin is the craziest human who ever walked the world. Certainly not a fan of Vladimir Putin, but this is the type of thing you say, or you say that he's worse than Hitler. You don't negotiate with people who are worse than Hitler. Now I think today it's that he has no idea what's happening in Ukraine, or Ukraine can win. I mean, technically, I guess, Ukraine could win against a nuclear-armed, massive country like Russia, but we should think through what that means. Are we prepared to engage and support fully for 20 years, or whatever it would take to defeat them, and what that would cost us and the rest of the world stage? We should at least have that conversation. We should have that debate rather than just regurgitating whatever the latest talking point is as a means of keeping us from getting to the table. If you care about Ukraine, if you care about that country having an existence going forward and not being completely destroyed and not every person being killed, you should be at the very least debating these things, or just thinking about what the consequences of never trying to end this war without regime change in Russia might be.
I think Democratic Party propaganda has been most effective, much more so than Russia, and it makes you wonder. I wrote an article recently for Sorab's awesome new magazine, Compact, and one of the arguments I made is that of course there's information warfare between combatants. Why are we being targeted? Why is the American public being targeted with a propaganda campaign? And my conviction is that because we are also being targeted because our establishment is at war with the American public. I think that's what's going on, and so we can break these things off if we can distinguish the war in Eastern Europe from the ongoing campaign against the American public. I think that's one way to see things more clearly. The other thing is, I think a lot of Americans have a pretty good sense of, even if the information on Ukraine is not entirely clear, I think a lot of people know. I heard the other day a U.S. senator speaking about, like, look, I'm not saying we should be sending troops to Ukraine, but we got to get a no-fly zone. We got to send missiles. We got to send this. We got to send that. We got to get them planes. We got to get them guns. I'm like, we're talking about Russia's border, right? The United States has interest around the world. We have real adversaries around the world. And I don't believe that Vladimir Putin has good intentions for the United States of America. I genuinely believe he is a problem for American interest, and there are others. But foreign policy is first of all, when we talk about geopolitics, the first thing geopolitics is looking at a map. And when we look at the map here, the idea that we're sending all of these goods to Russia's border, and no one is saying, or few people in positions of power saying, hold on a second, let's stop and think about this, and we can't just let our foreign policy, our drifting foreign policy toward Vladimir Putin and Russia continue to go in this way, because we could wind up in a lot of trouble here.
Well, if you look at the flags everywhere, and if you look at the Kennedy Center, which has now for weeks been lit every night with the Ukrainian colors, you have to ask yourself, visually, from the aesthetics of propaganda, what would change if we were actually belligerents in this conflict? I mean, in a lot of ways, we seem to be, at least in the information sphere, already fully engaged. And that's concerning because, of course, that implies or leads to, or it's an escalatory rhetoric that I don't want to see that future.
This is a great point, because it struck me that when they talk about sanctioning Russia and it's going to hurt the Russian people and we're going to crush the ruble, effectively the American public has been sanctioned, right? This is what high inflation looks like. This is what energy shortages look like. This is what food shortages, if they happen, as President Biden forewarns, will look like. That the American public has been sanctioned. So that's very effective, the point you make, saying, how would this look different? Yeah, that's what it looks like.
So one of the reasons why reporters are so important, and I realize there's always going to be a fog of war with battlefield reporting, is you do want to get good information about what's going on. We've gotten some numbers about how many Russian troops have been killed. It's a very high number. We've gotten very little or maybe no information on how many Ukrainians have been killed in this war. We need that kind of good information. So we need better reporting. Unfortunately, many of the reporters who are stationed can sometimes blur the line between reporter and advocacy or obliterate it altogether. Where you saw Richard Stengel calling for strafing of convoys or so, on air while he was talking about it. That's not reporting. I also think we should talk a little bit about how media control political opposition. And one of the things that's interesting about, I totally agree with you that media bias is an insufficient or inaccurate prism from which to look through this. But it is true that corrupt media are completely hostile to Republicans and conservatives, and that plays a role because the only time a Republican elected official can get anything even remotely favorable in coverage is if he or she is pursuing escalatory rhetoric or pushing for war. The only time a Democrat a politician gets negative coverage is if he or she is not doing that. This is an important thing for people to recognize so that when Republican or other officials go to these hostile media networks, they need to not be so desperate for positive attention that they engage in this kind of rhetoric. And there needs to probably be more pushback against it, just like a courage and a confidence in themselves that seems to be lacking among most Republicans. I worry that they also don't think enough about grand strategy to think through what, I think you've seen this general idea in both the media and pundit and the political classes, which is we get a feeling the American people don't want troops on the ground. And that is true. Americans both parties have expressed that pretty consistently. But they seem to think that they can do literally anything up to that point, no matter how bad the effect is on the American people or on our national interests, so long as they just don't do that one thing.
No, I was going to say I absolutely agree. And when Republican officials get on places like CNN or MSNBC, it's important for them to understand that they're being wrapped up in these intelligence operations that will not only come back and hurt them, but will hurt their constituents as well and the American public. So, the gain to get a few, get a few attaboys for being on CNN, the cost is extraordinarily high, and especially in this case, these people now, they just find themselves going off on these terrific risks. Like, yes, I'm not saying that we're going to send arms or send troops, but right. Anything else, a no-fly zone, whatever it takes, bombs painted, hey Putin, but that's outrageous.
So the war party transcends our ordinary Republican-Democrat partisanship. It supersedes.
Well, I think there's the issue, I do think there's a bipartisan consensus in DC on foreign policy. It's usually the wrong consensus to have. But there's an extra part about it, which is this level of interventionism is politically toxic. You see that people don't vote for it. So the media, our corrupt media, I think they like it if the Republican Party is the one that owns the conflict and the political costs. They get what they want in terms of the interventionism, and their preferred political party, which is quite obviously the Democrat Party, doesn't pay as much politically for the cost.
I'd like to talk about the word disinformation. Micah brought up a few moments ago the ghost of Kiev, the ace pilot who had 47 kills in 4 days or something, or the Snake Island story in which the entire base was killed except, oops, they weren't, or the old Ukrainian grandmother handing out sunflower seeds to Russian soldiers. All of these stories were huge in American media in the early days of the invasion, and all of them were eventually debunked. So I was fascinated to see a viral thread on Twitter from a woman with a PhD who said, "Disinformation expert here. Let me tell you why the Ghost of Kiev and Snake Island stories are fine, even if they're technically not true. They're valuable tools in the information war. They help support Ukrainian morale. So let me reassure you, given my expertise in disinformation, this kind of disinformation is okay." So I've seen a lot of people who are experts in this term, in this surprising field, using that word and that purported expertise to shut down conversation. Is that the only use of the term disinformation? Does it have any non-political inherent meaning?
It's a growth industry, right? We saw during Russiagate a number of people who became disinformation experts. These people have garbage minds and they're morons. And so Russiagate actually created a lot of jobs. Mollie was referring to a few of them before, but it was extremely dangerous in that way. But I have a real piece of real disinformation. How's this? Joe Biden is digging in on Vladimir Putin. He's really tough, and Joe Biden wants a piece of Vladimir Putin, and this man must go. They must do this and that. That's what Joe Biden says. That's what the press says about Joe Biden. Here's what's happening with Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin off on another stage in Vienna, Austria. Biden negotiators are working with Putin negotiators to ensure that the Iran nuclear deal is restored. What will happen once the deal is restored? The Iranians will become a Russian nuclear client and a Russian arms client, which means that Joe Biden is ensuring that Vladimir Putin's war chest will be filled. So this is why it's important to have some detail on what's going on, and when people get carried away, and I think it's quite possible, given the disposition of this president at present, I think it's very possible that he could drag this country into a very bad situation. For the time being, though, it's very important to understand what the real details are here and what the nature of the relationship is, the real relationship between the Biden administration and Vladimir Putin. He is aiming to enrich Putin official.
I think of disinformation kind of like conspiracy theories. They solve some kind of problem you're having in your mind. And I think that one of the things people have to acknowledge here is that it would be nice if some of these things were true. It would be so nice if Ukraine could easily vanquish Russia, or if these bold acts of courage were happening and making a difference. Americans want countries that are seeking to expand their freedoms to prevail, and those that they view as not having an expansion of freedoms to not prevail. And so there is some, disinformation works because we want it to work. We want to believe these things. This is another problem with media coverage. The story of what's happening in Ukraine, the story of our larger foreign policy concerns, is complicated, and it involves a lot of bad people. Now, it's always involved a lot of bad people. We've been willing to work with bad people since the very beginning, but it's kind of it's a more complicated story, and so our media, by definition, simplify and dumb things down. Sometimes that's good. Someone out there can't come to this whole conference, so they might appreciate a write-up that accurately conveys what was said from the stage. That's a simplification that's helpful. A lot of the simplifications we see when it comes to the strategic decisions we're having to make are just not particularly helpful, and they resort to disinformation that clouds and obstructs good ends, particularly for our national interest, than we would like.
I think something that's striking is that the best information we have on the ground in Ukraine seems to show that conflict between peer competitors, setting aside Russia's nuclear status, is really, really hard. And that ought to be a warning to us that we don't want to get further involved in this conflict. But instead of recognizing that this is going slower perhaps than intelligence services on both sides of the Atlantic thought, that this is much bloodier than intelligence services on both sides of the Atlantic thought, we still have this idea that if we were to swoop in, it would be fine, that a no-fly zone would be easily enforced. It wouldn't escalate from there. And that's remarkably dangerous. I mean, we've become so used to the conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq, where we did have a just huge gradation of technological superiority to the enemy, that perhaps we have forgotten what it would look like to fight people whose tanks are worse, but not that much worse than ours. And that's scary to see.
That's actually a really good point that I think people should remember. Right when Russia invaded and went much bigger than I think anyone thought that they would go, then right away, within like 4 days, they hadn't taken the whole country, and so the talking point was, well, this is failing. And it's good to just know your basic invasion and takeover of capital city history, like even when the United States and the UK went into Iraq, we could not have been, that could not have been a more uneven match. And it still took us like how many weeks to take Baghdad, and it took so much aerial support and so much effort. And so it would be helpful, again, if journalists would put things in context. That's probably the most recent, somewhat similar situation to what we're dealing with. Russia has the nukes. That makes, they know that that gives them something of an advantage. But there isn't quite the level of disparity between their militaries otherwise, particularly because of how much we've done to help Ukraine. And so we should not be so surprised that it has taken this long thus far, or that it could go on for a very long period of time. And whether we really want to do that and be, at war in every means other than boots on the ground, and what that means for the economic costs, and what that means in terms of the opportunity costs of what we're not paying attention to because we're doing this. This is why good information and context and good historical knowledge would be helpful from our media types, which seems to be lacking.
Oh, it would be great if journalists did that instead of what they're actually doing. So when it comes to journalists manipulating public perception to the disadvantage of foreign policy restraint, we got a good illustration of how the sausage is made about a week and a half ago. Candace Owens, who is not a journalist whose work I follow, but I thought it was interesting that she posted an email she received from a New York Times fact checker. Hi there, I'm writing for the New York Times. We're working on a story about Russian messaging. We note that you advanced the idea that Ukraine was a corrupt country, which matched comments we've seen from Russian state media. Would you care to comment? And we've come to a pretty pass when you're accused of spreading Kremlin propaganda by saying that Ukraine is a corrupt country. I don't know. Ukraine is a corrupt country. Come and get me.
Did you see how she responded?
With links to
She
New
responded
York
with
Times
links to New York
stories.
Times articles about Ukraine being corrupt, which was how you should respond to people who claim to be fact checkers.
Well, precisely, and that's my question to you all. How do you handle it when the disinformation coming from journalists is so brazen?
Because I think that the way to understand that is that's part of the war. That's part of the war on the American public. That's what that propaganda is purposed for, right? To dismiss her as pro-Putin. And remember how this started, of course. Started with Russiagate. Donald Trump is pro-Putin. This rolls over, and therefore, Donald Trump's supporters are also disloyal. They voted for a man who was obviously colluding with Vladimir Putin to win the presidency. American voters, at least half of the country, Donald Trump supporters are disloyal. And this rolls over into January 6th. Anyone who didn't vote for Joe Biden is an insurrectionist or a domestic terrorist, right? It's not just someone who's an opponent. It's not just someone who's criticizing. You're disloyal. You're not really an American. Remember Barack Obama's phrase? That's not who we are as Americans. That phrase was always intended to put at least half the country on the other side. That's what's still going on. That's the purpose about labeling people who have questions about what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, just questions. Just saying, you know what, I don't believe this guy because this guy on TV now has been peddling for 6 years how Vladimir Putin controls Donald Trump, and I know that's a lie, and now I'm expected to believe that this guy really knows what Vladimir Putin is doing? I don't buy it. That person, for questioning these monsters, these animals, is called pro-Putin. And that's the purpose of the attack on Candace Owen. She's disloyal. Anyone who doesn't follow this line is a disloyal American.
I think it also just points to how we need far more serious people engaged in these discussions. It's not just reporters we see covering this who are not up to snuff. It's also the pundit class. And we need, and then it's also the people who are actually in charge. We're really not doing well in this country. The idea that you can totally view Putin as an adversary committing an unjust war, but because you don't want nuclear annihilation, that makes you a Putin apologist, is just stupid. It's just not something serious, smart people say. And so I think people who do understand a little bit about foreign policy, a little bit about history, should just push back and treat them as disdainfully as they have earned.
I mean, I think there are a lot of national security and counterterrorism experts who are looking for something to do. So disinformation and counter domestic terrorism, and here's the new big gig for your tenured chair at wherever. So.
All right, well, in a few moments, we're going to be ready to switch over to audience Q&A. So before we do that, I just wanted to go through each of our panelists quickly and say, do you have a real hall of shame moment when your jaw was on the floor in the past month during this Ukraine situation for a real journalistic gaffe, when someone said or did something or tried to pull a line that you just couldn't believe?
I've got one. I'll volunteer. I'm the former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor. Right? I think his first name is William. But I see this guy on TV, and he's talking about Ukraine. I'm like, that guy testified at the impeachment hearings to bring down Donald Trump over Ukraine. And now anyone is supposed to believe that this guy is serious about what he's saying on TV? So that's the one that knocked me out of my chair. There's been a lot of bad stuff, but that's the one that really, I wouldn't say that shocked me, but it was something else.
When the State Department said that there would be a false flag video used by the Russians as excuse to invade, and when a journalist did his job and pushed back and said, look, you don't have a great record on this stuff, do you have more proof for us? You should just believe us because we told you so. You know, if they want to keep telling on themselves, I hope they will, but it was shocking. It was balder than usual.
My hatred and contempt of much of corporate media is so extensive that I don't think I can pick out a particular example. But just in general, I have been somewhat mortified that even in the White House press briefings, you hear almost no one, and most days, no one pushing for statesmanship or leadership or a way to end bad things happening globally. They seem to feed off of disinformation, even something as simple as, and this really speaks to what Lee was saying about a proper read of the Washington Post's limited hangout. You know, limited hangout is when you get caught and then you do it like a little bit of honesty as a spy to keep the con going. That's what their Hunter Biden pieces have been about. But the Washington Post breaks this big story. They had a side story, by the way, that said, how did we verify that this Hunter Biden laptop was real? And it was like, first, you waited 2 years. So let's not act like you did something really great when other media outlets were doing it for years. But the Washington Post itself didn't ask any questions about this. This relates to the very current conflict. If we want to have a good leg to stand on to fight against Russian disinformation, we can't have the President of the United States knowingly and falsely accusing Vladimir Putin of meddling in the 2020 election with the Hunter Biden laptop. And yet he did that, you know, on stage at the debate, and otherwise his campaign was pushing this line that Vladimir Putin had personally meddled. This is we might kind of like grow tired of it because we've been hearing this for so long, but it can have serious implications globally, and a media that participate in it rather than push back against it is also dangerous.
I know we want to get just very quickly. I think that's such an important point. We watched Russiagate. We watched all of this stuff accusing the Russians accusing the Russians of interfering here, dismissing everything as Russian disinformation, but it appears that no one really understood that Russia's a real country. Outside of Washington and New York newsrooms, Russia is a real thing. And the idea that the officials, the senior officials of that country that we turned into the boogeyman, they had different ideas about things. You're right. I can't imagine what it would be like for this administration to try to sit down with the same Russians they tried to frame for the 2016 election.
Well, the Russians have done their fair share of lying on this as well. So.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I'm just saying from here, the way we're seeing it with our, you know.
All right, John, I think, is on the floor with audience questions. If we've got one, let's hear it.
All right, so it looks like we have a few up there, one back here.
Hi, Augusta Salzona, former senior foreign policy and social issues advisor, Trump President campaign 2016. My question is this, since this is about the media, who are our friends, the friends of this movement, in the fake news, lamestream media today, and I include Fox News in that, and possibly even Newsmax. Other than Tucker Carlson, is there anybody else of these talking heads on cable and the airwaves that at least show some respect to our side, our perspective here on foreign policy?
Mollie's on Fox. We should give her credit for the work she's doing there.
Well, I think anyone who reports things accurately and fairly is a friend to people who care about truth. And so I don't, I kind of look at it differently, but I do value being at a place where we at least are allowed to have debates. You don't see a lot of debates happening elsewhere. It is a vibrant debate going on, but it's good. You get good perspectives from across the spectrum when you have people with different viewpoints. But I do think it's important that people understand just how bad the situation is, not just with cable or TV news, but the entire media ecosphere is not at a high point right now, and they have openly embraced going from mere bias or even like pretending to aim toward objectivity to just embracing that they are propagandists, and that's not good for the country. If you read your Tocqueville, you want lots of media outlets pushing back against those in power, or viewing things from a variety of perspectives. That's healthy and good for the sustenance of the republic, and we don't have that. We have a corporate-controlled press that is narrowing the scope of discussion, and because of what tech firms are doing with deplatforming and censoring people, and there's like all-out war against freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and just against the idea of speech being a good way, debate and being able to find your own way toward truth. So we have very serious problems.
So unless anybody has anything else on that, I think we're a little tight on time. So let's thank our panel. Round of applause.